The Bf-110 G4 is one of the first radar-equipped aircraft in War Thunder. Let's check it out. What we're looking at in War Thunder are two versions of the Bf-110 G4, a strike aircraft in rank 3 of the German tech tree, and an Italian premium aircraft, both at battle rating 3.7. This plane has a pretty unique and complicated weapon system for a low-tier prop fighter, and it even gets a radar set. The Bf-110 carries the FUG-220, which is a B-band dipole search radar. I'll put a link to my radar tutorial in a pinned comment if you need a refresher, but in short, the FUG-220 is only situationally useful, and it really isn't as much of a game changer in War Thunder as it was out in real life. Its main forward-facing armaments are a set of 30mm cannons and 20mm cannons mounted in the nose and chin respectively. It can also take more 20mm cannons in a gun pod. The ammo belts for both get lots of Miscellaneous ammo, which is always nice, and can do enormous damage to anything you tag with the cannons. The Bf-110 also has a rear gunner with an MG81. I usually take the APT belt for the turret, and lastly, the plane gets another pair of 20mm cannons that fire vertically in a Skrajmusik configuration. Only one ammo belt, and more on that later. For loadouts, the plane can take a gun pod, dumb bombs, or unguided rockets mounted as external weapons. The rockets are mounted pretty far out on the wings, and I personally find them really difficult to use, but its larger bombs and gun pod are all mounted on the center line, and generally speaking, the Bf-110 has external loadouts for both air-to-air or air-to-ground mission profiles. The flight performance of the Bf-110 G4 has a lot of issues. The climb performance is slightly above average for a twin-engined fighter at this BR, but still well below average of the majority of single-engine fighters it faces. It gets an air spawn, so at the start of the battle it has the performance to climb up and try to intercept bombers, more on that later, but on some maps it'll just barely miss catching them. Its maximum speed isn't great, and the radar antennas create a fair and noticeable amount of extra drag, which does have an impact on the G4 compared to other versions of the Bf-110, and overall the plane feels rather slow for its BR. And this is really compounded if you take any additional external ordnance, like the rockets out on the wings or the extra gun pod under the fuselage. The plane's maneuverability is pretty atrocious. It has a below average rate of roll, and that's the good news. Basically, everything else suffers. It can't turn as fast or as tight as almost any of the single-engine planes it faces. It's got a laggy rudder, which makes stability in coordinated turns more difficult, which in turn makes aiming its cannons against maneuvering targets more difficult. And really, it's just a heavy plane with bad energy retention. The Bf-110 has combat flaps, but using them effectively is more art than science, and really you only want to drop them for a few seconds at a time in most situations. The plane doesn't have any air brakes, so careful throttle management is going to be critical in diving attacks or when you're coming down from high altitude. One other thing to know is that despite the plane's poor agility, it's actually fairly tough. This plane can survive an impressive amount of damage before going down, and it can make it back to base on just one engine, so long as that engine doesn't overheat. It also has a small amount of armor scattered around the plane, which helps the crew a bit and gives a small measure of protection against light machine gun hits, which is actually pretty useful in close air support. Out in air battles, the Bf-110 G4 is a bit of a different experience even from other twin-engine heavy fighters. This plane really struggles in any kind of a dogfighting situation, even against most other twin-engine planes, so you really need to find ways to try and engage targets without getting sucked into turn fights. The good news is this plane's firepower. The huge cluster of heavy cannons right on the center line, and tons of Miscellaneous ammo let this plane just absolutely delete anything it can get just a couple of good solid hits on. In realistic battles, the constraints of the game mode usually won't allow the 110 to go out and carry the team or anything, and if you get even 2 or 3 kills with it, you should consider that a good match, considering how vulnerable the plane is to single-engine fighters. In arcade battles, you can often get more kills per sortie since the enemy targets respawn, but the flight model buffs don't really help much, and you're still going to need to be really careful with your engagements to try and avoid turning fights. The radar won't be especially useful below around 3,000 meters or so, and the spotting mechanics in both realistic and arcade battles kinda reduce its utility anyway. Still, it can be relevant out above a ground battle or in simulator missions, but it's not really going to be a huge game changer for you. As a special note, the upward-firing Skrajmuzik cannons are capable of shooting down planes by flying below them and shooting up into the bottom of them. At least on paper, they're capable of it. In practice, this pair of guns has pretty low firepower, only one mediocre ammo belt, and they're incredibly difficult to actually aim and land hits with, especially if the target does defensive maneuvering. You're also highly vulnerable to enemy gun turrets if you're attacking a bomber with the up guns. Now, you can sometimes switch to them for a quick glancing hit in a turn fight, but in a realistic sense, it's really more of a gimmick. In terms of ground attack, I find the rockets almost impossible to hit targets with as they're mounted really far out on the wings, but the bombs are pretty easy to aim, and the cannons can take out light ground targets all on their own. I'd rate this plane slightly above average for ground pounding and close air support. As for the context of this plane out in the real world, during Germany's rearmament in the early 1930s, the Ministry of Aviation put out an RFP for a new plane that was intended from the outset to be kind of a flexible jack-of-all-trades. They called this the destroyer concept. It needed speed, range, a bomb bay, heavy armament, and twin engines. Several designs for this were considered, but the Bf-110 from Messerschmitt was eventually chosen to fill the need. When it first flew in 1936, the 110 was well ahead of its time and had a pretty good number of design innovations. However, the early model DB600 engines were a pretty constant source of problems, leading to weaker engines being used until the improved DB601s were ready near the end of 1938. The 110 gained an early reputation as a highly effective aircraft during the opening stages of World War II, but that changed during the Battle of Britain. When the 110 started to encounter single-engined Allied fighters that could match its speed, the plane's general lack of agility, along with some really serious tactical errors, led to significant losses, and it was transitioned out of its bomber escort role pretty quickly. During the course of the war, the 110 was produced in large quantities of different versions, custom-built for a whole bunch of purposes, including traditional fighter interceptors, close air support, reconnaissance, and night fighters. The night fighter role really proved to be the 110's most successful job, with later G-model versions getting radar sets and heavy cannons while retaining the ability to carry external weapon loads. An attempt was made to replace the 110 with the Me-210, but the wing shape and aerodynamics of the 210 ended up having some really fundamental design flaws, and as a result of this, the Bf-110 ended up flying all the way to the end of the war, despite increasing obsolescence and severe vulnerability to late-war Allied fighters in air combat. In total, a bit over 6,000 Bf-110s were built. Visually, I've always liked twin-engine prop fighters, and in my opinion, the clunky radar antenna on the front of the plane actually looks kinda badass. Both the German and Italian versions of the plane only get one paint job each, and they're both pretty plain-looking, but not really bad. Overall, I think this is a good plane to look at. Landing the Bf-110 is pretty basic. You can drop gear and landing flaps at around 300 kilometers an hour, and there's basically no risk of nosing over when you work the brakes. The plane still handles pretty well on final approach, and in general, it's got really simple landing performance. The cockpit actually isn't too bad. The bracing isn't as obstructive as you might expect, and the visibility's okay. but the instruments are all drawn on, since this is a really old cockpit model from the early days of War Thunder. Overall, it wasn't bad to fly in VR though. To close out on the Bf-110 G4. This plane has a very impolite amount of forward firepower. It's got upguns, it's reasonably tough, has good external weapons, and it's got radar. However, it'll just never be a dogfighter. The upguns are pretty difficult to use, and the radar doesn't help you much outside of simulator battles. The final verdict on the Bf-110 G4 is that this plane is full of amusing gimmicks. Firepower that can just delete anything it hits, radar, and the upward-facing guns are all fun little tricks, but as an overall package, it's a very difficult plane to get high-scoring matches with, and the crappy flight performance is just too much of a liability in most of War Thunder's current game modes. As always, thanks for watching.